Hello and welcome to the FSAI Breakfast Bite on Shelf Life. Today I'm joined by Lenahan and she's going to discuss how to safely set and validate the shelf life for the food you manufacture. Today's event will last for 40 minutes, so there will be a 30-minute presentation followed by a 10-minute Q&A. If you're on social media, you can let us know you're here with hashtag FSAI events. If you have any questions, pop them into a questions box and we will get to them at the end. And so without further ado, I will pass you over to Mary.
Thanks, Elaine. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to this morning's breakfast bite on shelf life. So we're about 30 minutes today. I'm going to talk to you about things you need to consider when you're setting a safe shelf life for your food, a little bit about the legislation in relation to shelf life, some aspects you need to consider when you're getting shelf life testing carried out, and then how you use all this information to determine a safe shelf life for your food. And we'll finish up pointing to some useful FSAI information and resources. So considerations for setting shelf life. So what is shelf life? It's the length of time food maintains its safety and quality over reasonably foreseeable conditions of distribution, storage, and use. Today's presentation, we're mostly going to focus on setting a safe shelf life in relation to microbiological food safety. But of course, shelf life always goes hand in hand with the quality of the food over the shelf life. And here you're really thinking about food spoilage bacteria. But the key thing to remember is that for any food that's spoiled, it's usually visibly spoiled, or it smells bad, or it tastes bad. So it's easy for the consumer to see that food is bad and I shouldn't eat it. When it comes to pathogens or food poisoning bacteria growing in a food, like Salmonella, Listeria monocytogenes, or Campylobacter, these are pathogens that a consumer cannot see in the food. The food doesn't taste bad, it doesn't smell bad. So it's really hard for the consumer to know that there might be pathogens growing in that food to a level that will make them sick if they eat that food. So it's really important that you, as a food business operator, ensures that the shelf life of the food is safe over the shelf life of the product. So the legislation says you need to take into consideration reasonably foreseeable conditions of distribution, storage, and use. But what does that mean? So it really means that you need to take into consideration the worst case scenario. So if you're manufacturing a chilled product and it's distributed from your manufacturing place to the retail shop where it's sold, and then the consumer takes that product home to their fridge, is there any potential for temperature abuse? And do you need to take that into consideration? Because that will impact the amount of time you get reasonably on the shelf life of your product. And when the consumer brings that product home, what's the temperature in their own fridge? We know from consumer data in Ireland that about 50% of Irish consumers have their fridge operating at temperatures that are higher than the best recommended temperature of 5 degrees Celsius. And basically, the higher the temperature any food is held at, any bacteria such as pathogens or spoilage bacteria will grow faster. Then you need to consider, how will that final consumer use your food? So there's two different categories that food falls into, ready to eat food or non-ready to eat food. So food like deli meats, for example, or cheeses are ready to eat. So these are foods that the consumer can eat without heating that food or processing it further. So any pathogens that are present on those ready to eat foods, there's going to be nothing there, no processing or cooking to get rid of that pathogen. And if they're at a level that will make the consumer sick, it's a real risk, and that food will be considered unsafe. For non-ready to eat food, particularly for raw meats, you can assume there'll probably be a pathogen present like Salmonella or Campylobacter, but if that food is cooked properly, it should get rid of any risk. For ready to eat food, we're particularly concerned with Listeria monocytogenes, and this is a pathogen that grows very slowly at refrigeration temperatures. It can make very vulnerable people in particular, such as older adults, those that are very young, those that are pregnant or immunocompromised, very sick. We get about 20 cases of listeriosis in Ireland a year, but what makes this pathogen unusual is it has a very high fatality rate. So there is legislation to say if you're manufacturing a ready-to-eat food, you need to check if there's listeria in that food, and it needs to be able to control it so it doesn't grow to a level that would make people sick. When it comes to non-ready-to-eat food, if it's something like, say, this lasagna here, that you cook in your own premises and then you package it and you label it with cooking instructions for the consumer to fully reheat before they eat it, you need to make sure that those cooking instructions are valid, to make sure that the food will be fully reheated to 70 degrees at its core. And any food that's labelled, say, with the label to say can be eaten hot or cold, or if the cooking instructions are not enough for a full reheat, but say for palatability purposes, those foods will be falling into ready-to-eat category by default, and you'll need to comply with any criteria for ready-to-eat food. Anyone who packages or sells food that requires a shelf life declaration is responsible for estimating and setting that shelf life. You'll see in today's presentation there's a lot of different factors that will affect the safety of food and lead to a variation in shelf life. It's not a unique science, or it's not an exact science. It's unique to each food, and you need to not extend the results to other products, because other products could have different characteristics, even though you might be manufacturing all those products. It's best to develop shelf life at the new product development stage. And I would say, you as the food business operator, it's your knowledge of your own food product and your processing environments that's the best basis for determining an accurate shelf life determination. In FSAI, we have Guidance Note 18, and this is our guidance on establishing and validating product shelf life. So we would recommend that you follow the steps in Guidance Note 18. Today I'm going to give you a quick overview of those steps, but if you really want the detail, I'd recommend you go to our guidance note. Just to note, currently Guidance Note 18 is on revision 4, but it's being updated, and we expect to publish revision 5 in the coming weeks. There are a small number of foods that do not require any shelf life declaration at all, and this is set down in the legislation on labelling called Food Information to the Consumer, or FIC. So in Annex 10, there's a full list of food that's exempt from date marking. An example is fresh fruit and vegetables, including potatoes, which have not been peeled or cut or similarly treated. You might have noticed in the media recently, there has been some interest in some of the larger supermarkets are removing best before dates on their fresh fruit and vegetables. But this is actually not legally required, and a lot of the supermarkets are moving towards this to reduce food waste. So there's a number of things that influence shelf life. And these can be split into what's called intrinsic characteristics. So these are characteristics that are internally part of the food, naturally part of the food. And then external characteristics or extrinsic characteristics. So these are things that are external to the food and that maybe you can control some of them. So things like the microbiological quality of the ingredients, and this is common sense really, the better the quality of the ingredients that you use, the better the longer shelf life you'll get on your end product. Depending on how you process that product, you might be able to lower the pH, which is a measure of how acidic a food is, or lower the water activity. And this is the amount of water that's available in a food for a bacteria to use and grow. So something like fermentation, where you add a starter culture to a food, as a byproduct of that, acid is produced and it lowers the pH. Any food that has a low pH, generally pathogens are not able to grow. Same with water activity. If you say a dried food, you will be able to lower the water activity, and any pathogens at present will not be able to grow. Have you used any preservatives when you've made that food? So if you use a preservative, you might be able to extend the shelf life of the food. And then you have external characteristics. And one of the really key points is good manufacturing practices and your food safety management as part of your food safety management system, and being able to identify any hazards that are relevant to your food as part of your hazard analysis and critical control point based procedures, and putting in appropriate control measures to control any hazards so that they don't pose a risk to the person eating the food. You know, it's best not to put too much faith into the results of shelf life testing, because you can't test 100% of the food that you manufacture. and bacteria is not uniformly present in a food. So testing is really a good tool to verify that you have good manufacturing and good hygiene practices in place, and that you're monitoring and controlling your hazards really well. But testing is never a 100% guarantee of safety. We talked about storage temperature a little bit there. Essentially, the higher the storage temperature, the quicker any bacteria that's present will grow. You can extend the shelf life of food by doing different things like packaging that food in modified gas atmosphere or vacuum packing. So this is where you remove the air. A lot of bacteria need oxygen to grow. So if you remove that oxygen, you're going to reduce the growth of those bacteria. I will caution that some pathogens and even some spoilage bacteria can grow in what's called anaerobic atmosphere. So this is where there is no oxygen present, and you need to take that into consideration if you're producing a food that's packed in this way. The type of packaging as well will influence the shelf life that you get on that product. So if you're packing something in modified gas atmosphere, you need to make sure the packaging is impermeable, so no gas escapes and no air from the outside gets into your food, thereby reducing the food product. If you have foods that are packed in gas atmosphere, and once you open that package, that shelf life is no longer applied, so because the air will have come in contact with the food. So something to bear in mind. How you process the food as well will be a way to potentially extend the shelf life. So if you treat it with food heat, depending on the type of heat treatment, you might be able to extend the shelf life by a few days. If it's something like canning, you can extend the shelf life to a few years. Chilling food will slow down the growth of any pathogens or spoilage bacteria present. Or freezing is like pressing a pause button. So the bacteria will still be in the food, but they won't be able to grow once that food is frozen. But once you defrost the food, remember, it's like pressing that pause button again, and any bacteria that are present will grow again. So it's best to use that food within 24 hours of fully defrosting. Now we're going to move on to a little bit about the shelf life in relation to the legislation. So we have Regulation 178 of 2002, and this is called the General Food Law. And in that legislation, under Article 14, it says, food shall not be placed on the market if it is unsafe. Unsafe food is food that is injurious to the consumer or considered unfit for human consumption. So as a food business operator, your main responsibility is to ensure that you put safe food on the market. Regulation 852 of 2004 is around the general hygiene requirements and the need to put in hazard analysis and critical control point based procedures. So this is where you identify any hazards that are relevant to your food, and then you put in appropriate control measures to control those hazards so that they no longer pose a risk to the person eating the food. Regulation 2073 of 2005 lists different microbiological criteria for food safety and process hygiene. So you need to check the list of foods that's in that legislation and see if any applies to the food that you're making, and make sure you comply with it if you need to. And then lastly, we have Regulation 1169, Food Information to the Consumer, or FIC, as I discussed before. So this has a lot of different requirements around labelling, and it also has a requirement for date marking, so how you put use by or best before dates on your food. So Article 24 of that legislation is the main bit around date marking and Annex 10. So now we're going to move on. We have a poll for you today. So my colleague Elaine is going to launch the poll there, and we're asking you, when is the use by date labelled on a food product? We'll just give everybody a minute to fill in the responses. Okay, great. So we have about 60% of people voting now. Yeah, so we're seeing a clear winner, and most of you are right here that about 90% of you have said that when food safety is related, or when the shelf life is related to food safety. Yeah, so a use by date is put on a food when it relates to food safety, and a best before date is labelled on a food when it relates to food quality. So usually short shelf life perishable foods carry a use-by date, and once that date is passed, foods should not be eaten past that date because it's considered to be unsafe. Foods that are labelled with best before are foods that are usually stored at ambient temperatures, things like pasta and rice. And once the best before date is passed, that food could be eaten past that date, but just knowing that the quality of that food is probably not as good as it would have been before the date. Another way to think about it is that a use-by date is a deadline. So once that date is passed, you can't eat the food. But the best before date is a guideline. And then after that, you really encourage consumers to use their common sense. You know, look at the food. Does it look okay? Does it smell okay? Does it taste okay? If you think the food looks like it's gone bad, use your common sense and don't eat that food. We have European Food Safety Authority, or EFSA guidance. They've published two very large pieces of guidance on use-by dates and best before dates. I put out these two decision trees from those guidance because they're quite useful, but if you want to read in more detail, go to the links for the guidance. And I know Elaine will be circulating some of the links that we discussed today for your information after the webinar. So the first decision tree is for food business operators to determine whether they should put a use-by date or a best before date on the food that they're producing. And then the second one is around labelling storage instructions on your food once that food has been opened. So as I said, for example, like a modified atmosphere packaging, once that food is opened, that original shelf life no longer applies. So you need to have instructions for use to the consumer. So it might say, once opened, store in the fridge and use within 3 days. Now we're going to move on to shelf life testing. A question we get in the Food Safety Authority all the time is, what foods require shelf life testing? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer to this question, and it really depends on the food. There's no one size fits all answer, and you have to go through all of the steps that I'm talking about today to come to the solution. So you as the food business operator, you have to look at your food in relation to the safety. So this is your primary concern. Is there any pathogenic bacteria you need to take into consideration and put in steps to control those? In terms of quality, is there spoilage bacteria that, like yeast and molds, for example, that you need to take into consideration? Are there other sensory properties that you might need to take into consideration? You need to look at all of the hazards. So today we're really looking at the microbiological hazards, but of course you need to think, is there any physical or chemical hazards you also should take into consideration? When it comes to the microbiological hazards, we have this piece of legislation, Regulation 2073. So you need to look at that and see, is there any relevant food safety or process hygiene criteria to the food that you're producing? And then you need to look at the shelf life studies and see what applies to the food that you're producing. And in particular, the shelf life studies refer to any foods that are ready to eat, and when you need to assess the growth of listeria in your food if it was present, and could it potentially grow to a level over 100 CFU per gram that would be could cause illness in the people that consume that food. So the studies in Annex 2 of that legislation, the first two are really pieces of information that the food business operator should be able to gather very easily. The first one is around the physiochemical characteristics of your product. So things that we talked about, the internal characteristics and the external characteristics. So the pH, the water activity, are you using preservatives, how is it packaged? All of these things you can gather and put into your product spec. Then when you've gathered that information, then you can go to scientific literature and research data and try and gather as much information as you possibly can on the microorganisms of concern to your food and how it might grow. So competent authorities like the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, the Department of Agriculture, and other competent authorities in other countries like the Food Standards Agency in the UK, they may have guides and information that will be useful. We might have national standards. In Ireland, we have the National Standards Authority of Ireland, and they have a number of different standards. There's a lot of industry guides, so some of them might have some useful information, some scientific papers. So basically, anything that you gather, you need to keep it all together and have it as a reference. And then when necessary, so depending on the information you gather from steps 1 and 2, you might need to carry out some additional studies, and these could include predictive modelling. So this is where you use a mathematical model to predict the growth of a microorganism that you're interested in that's relevant to your food in your particular food under different conditions. So you can input the temperature, the pH of the water activity, and you'd use the information that you've gathered on your food to input those. And then number 4 and 5 are really related to investigating how Listeria monocytogenes in particular will grow in ready-to-eat food. So a challenge study is where you, a lab inoculates a certain amount of bacteria into the food, and then they see how it grows under different conditions of distribution, storage, and use. A durability study is where there's a naturally present bacteria in a food and it's incubated at the different temperatures of distribution, storage, and use, and the lab sees how it will grow. Today, I only have 30 minutes to talk to you, so it's quite short. But if you're interested in knowing more about microbiological testing, Safe Food and the Food Safety Authority of Ireland did this webinar back in June, and there's a link here, and we'll send the link after the webinar today. And it goes through all the different things you need to understand when you're determining whether you have to carry out testing and how to interpret those results. So the webinar is about 2 hours long, but it's worth watching. So now we're going to use all of this information that we gathered to determine the shelf life of your food. And Guidance Note 18 is really your Bible, and it has a lot of detail, so I'm just going to skim through it very fast today, but if you want to find the detail, go to that Guidance Note. The first thing to do is really identify the risk in your product, and the best way to do that is gather as much detail as you can about your food and put it all into your product specification. So if it's a ready-to-eat food or not, how are you going to process it, how it's going to be packaged, what are the temperatures that it's going to be displayed at or distributed at, is there any legislative requirements, are there any other hazards that are not listed in the legislation but you should also consider. Then you use all of this information to gather information on the characteristics of your food and maybe some best practice guidance to help you estimate the shelf life of your food. So gather as much information as you can, and then use that information to make an educated guess as to what you think your shelf life, what shelf life you could obtain. You could also look at shelf life on similar products on the market as a guide, but if you're doing that, make sure that you're comparing like with like. So if you're producing a food, for example, that if you go back to that lasagna that you cook in your own premises and you sell it with full cooking instructions and it's on the market, if you're selling it in a plastic tray and it's just wrapped in cling film, you're not going to get the same shelf life as a similar product but it's packed in modified atmosphere packaging or it's frozen. So you need to make sure you're comparing like with like. Any information that you use to help you determine shelf life, make sure you file that reference and keep it as part of your evidence base for how you came to the conclusion that the shelf life that you're applying is a good shelf life and reasonable. And then every now and again, make sure you check to see if that source has been updated. When you've done all of that, you really need to think now, should I carry out microbiological testing to validate the shelf life of my food? And in some cases, you may need to carry out testing, and in others, maybe you don't need to carry out testing. So one of the first things to think about is, do you have to comply with any relevant legislation? Is there any other pathogens that's not listed in the legislation that could be a hazard, and you would be best to keep an eye on that as part of your obligation to produce safe food? Do you need to think about spoilage bacteria? Is it very useful for you to know how much spoilage bacteria is in your food to help you monitor shelf life? If you have an agreement with a retailer, for example, that you're selling your product to, you might have a customer specification, and that might set out some obligations for the when you get the food tested and what you need to test it for. If you're producing a food that you've determined is very low risk and microbiological testing isn't really useful, is there any other test that you could carry out that would be more useful? So for example, if you're producing a fermented plant-based product such as sauerkraut, we know it has a very low pH of less than 3.5 and it has a high salt concentration. Any bacteria that's present will not grow and survive those low pHs. So it's probably a better use of your time and money to buy a pH meter and monitor the pH of every batch of sauerkraut that you produce, rather than getting microbiological testing carried out. If you do decide that you need to carry out shelf life testing, use all the information you've gathered to determine which microorganisms you should test for. and choose a sample that represents the worst case scenario. So if you're manufacturing a salami, for example, and you've noticed that the pH you get on every batch of salami varies quite considerably, choose the worst case pH, so the highest pH, to give you the worst case scenario. Also use storage temperatures which reflect the worst case scenario. So in guidance note 18, we have recommendations for storage temperatures to mirror storage at distribution and retail and at the consumer end. And these are really in relation to Listeria monocytogenes growth in ready-to-eat food. When you're carrying out your shelf life studies, so say you've decided you think you'll get a 7-day shelf life on your product, run the study for a few days past that estimated shelf life. So you might run it for 9 days, for example. If you're testing a product that's got a very short shelf life, you might ask the lab to test that product every day. If you're testing a food that has a longer shelf life, so if it's maybe a month long or a few months long or a year long, you might ask the lab to test out space out the testing a little bit longer, so once a week or once a month. Once you've carried out the tests and you get the results, you need to interpret those results. So we would say interpretation of the test results should only be made by a trained food microbiologist in consultation with the testing laboratory. And then you need to assign an appropriate shelf life, which primarily ensures food safety. So we talked about that earlier. There is no way to tell when a food that is contaminated with pathogens visibly or by smell or taste that product might not be safe. Whereas for food spoilage, often you can see that food is visibly spoiled. So you need to remember the shelf life for food safety and for food spoilage might not be the same. So you could have a food that doesn't spoil for a very long time, but actually it, in terms of food safety, the Listeria monocytogenes on that ready-to-eat food grows very quickly and it has a much shorter shelf life in terms of its food safety. If you have a certain shelf life in mind for a product and you're not achieving that, you might need to think about going back and redeveloping that product to get a longer shelf life. Once you've set your shelf life, then you need to think about whether it's worth applying a margin of safety. So shelf life is not an exact value that terminates at a particular time and date. So it's unrealistic to expect the shelf life of food to be consistently accurate and reproducible under all circumstances. So you might think about introducing a little bit of wiggle room. So for example, if you found that you can get an 11-day shelf life on your product, bringing back that shelf life that you label on the product by 1 day to 10 days. So you have that 1 day safety margin should a consumer choose to consume that product 1 day after the shelf life has passed. Once the product is on the market, you need to verify and monitor the shelf life. So is the shelf life that you set reasonable? Are you getting a lot of consumer complaints about spoilage? And at this stage, you might need to think about bringing back the shelf life if you're getting a lot of complaints about, for example, yeast and mold on your product. Everything you do in relation to shelf life, make sure you document it and record it and file it so you have it available on demand should your inspector ask you to show how did you come to the shelf life that you've put on your product. So in summary, food business operators should demonstrate an ownership of your obligation to produce safe food, demonstrate an understanding of what shelf life means for your own food product, be logical and consistent in your approach, always be food product specific, make sure you're always meeting any legal requirements, and make sure you monitor and review the shelf life of food once it's on the market. And everything you do, make sure you document it and you make it available on demand. Now we're just going to finish up with some of the FSAI resources. We have a huge amount of information on our website. If you go to the food business tab on our website and you click on microbiological criteria and shelf life, you'll find a lot of information there. We talked about our publications. So guidance note 18 is really the Bible around setting shelf life and validating it for your product. We also have guidance note 27, and that gives you information on how to comply with microbiological criteria in the regulation 2073. We have 2 newer guidance notes that might be useful depending on what products you're making. One is around fermented plant-based products and a second on fermented meat products. We have a lot of information around labeling and complying with the Food Information to Consumer legislation. And we also have a leaflet on choosing a testing laboratory. And then finally, we have a lot of e-learning modules that you might find useful. So these are all free. They usually take about an hour to complete each one. We have 2 on microbiological criteria that you might be interested in. And after all of that, if you really can't find the answer to your query, you can email us at info@fsai.ie, so this is our advice line, and we endeavour to get back to you within 5 working days with a response to your query. So I'd like to thank you for listening today, and I think Elaine is going to open the floor for questions.
Thanks, Mary. I can see here from the questions box that the presentation was received really well. So I'm going to move on to the Q&A. So the first question I have here from our audience says, if I buy in a bigger bulk, if I buy in a bigger bulk packed food product from another food business and I divide that food into smaller amounts for resale, how do I set the shelf life?
Okay, thanks, Elaine. So if you buy in a bigger bulk packed product and you're dividing that product into smaller amounts and you're going to resell it, that's considered to be a new product. So you need to go through all the steps that we talked about today to set a new shelf life on that product. So you need to bear in mind, if you're buying in, say, a big bulk pack of chicken fillets and they're gas flushed, that gas is what's keeping the shelf life on that food. And once you open that packaging, that shelf life no longer applies. And we have guidance on gas flushed chicken fillets. So usually 2 days after you open that packaging is a good shelf life for the next stage if you're rewrapping it and reselling it. So really you need to go through all of the steps that we talked through today for anything that you do. So you're responsible as the next person producing that food, even though it's just taking the larger amount, putting it into a smaller amount and rewrapping it and reselling it. It's your responsibility to set the shelf life for that food.
Okay, thanks very much, Mary. For the next question, I see pie filling mentioned. So there appears to be an industry norm of a 3-day shelf life applied to products that have been opened. For example, a pie filling is made today. The assumption is that it can be used for a period of 3 days before it is no longer usable. Where would this 3-day assumption come from, and should it be followed?
Okay. I wonder, in our guidance note 27, we do say for any foods that are produced and say you give them a 2-day shelf life, so production plus 2 days, you don't need to carry out testing or comply with the criteria, because we consider that to be similar to making a product at home and having leftovers in your fridge and use it within 2 days. So maybe the 3 days is kind of a similar to that. It depends very much on the case by case. You know, if the pie filling has been cooked and cooled properly and then it's going to be reheated, if it's got a full cooking instruction on that pie, then it's a non-ready to eat food. The risk is probably low. If it's something that it's considered to be a ready to eat food, the risk could be higher. So you really, again, have to go through all the steps that we talked about today to decide what's suitable. But for anything that's sort of a 2-day shelf life, we wouldn't really expect them to go through all of this, all these processes.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So can you freeze foods, for example, meat, labels with a use by date, if you can't use it before the date labeled to avoid food waste?
Yeah, absolutely. So for meat, for example, you can freeze it right up to the date that's labeled on it on the use by date. And once you freeze it, once it says on the packaging that it's suitable for freezing. And once you freeze it, then when you want to defrost it and use it, it's best practice to defrost it in the fridge. And then once it's fully thawed, consume it within sort of 24 hours.
Thank you, Mary. So the next question here says, we supply frozen goods with a long shelf life. As a result, we could not carry out end-of-life testing in a lab before launching a product. What is the best way to get a scientific justification for determining shelf life?
Okay. So if you're producing a frozen fruit, it's going to be a best before date, because like I said, it's a pause button on your food. It really, again, depends on what that food is. It's very hard for me without knowing a lot of detail around the food, but if I don't know, for example, like a frozen pizza, I guess you would again go through all the steps that we talked about today. So good quality ingredients, you get a longer shelf life. And once, it depends as well what the instructions are for once you do you cook that fruit from frozen, do they defrost it and use it? Is it a non-ready to eat product, or you might have a dessert that is frozen and then the instructions are to defrost it and use it within a few days and eat it as a ready to eat food. So you have to take in all of these things into consideration, and it's really difficult for me to give a straightforward answer to that, but I think the best thing to do is when you're developing your product, make sure you put the best quality into it. And then, once you freeze the product, you could do trials where you do tests once it's used and after, I don't know, a month or something. It depends on how long the shelf life is. But it's a very difficult question to answer that one. But I think you just have to really go through all the steps that we talked about today.
Thanks, Mary. That's very helpful, I'm sure. The next one is a little bit similar to one of the questions with earlier. So, does food law allow a situation where the best before or use by date of the final foodstuff product is longer than the date of an ingredient of that product as indicated in the ingredient specification?
Okay. Again, so that will really just depend on a case by case. So let's say you're making a chicken stir fry. So if you're buying in that gas flush chicken, raw fillets of chicken in a gas flush pack, once you open that pack, so you take out the chicken fillets, you cut them up and you add vegetables and you sell them in a butcher shop, really you get 2 days on those raw fillets once they're kind of before they start spoiling. But if you open that gas flush and you cooked your chicken with the vegetables and then you sold it as a cooked product with either instructions to fully reheat, or maybe you might sell it as a ready to eat product and it's been fully cooked, you'll have changed the nature of the ingredient, so you probably get a longer shelf life. But in general, if it's a fresh food ingredient and it's going, so if you're making a sandwich, for example, and you're using sliced chicken in that sandwich, you'd have to take into consideration the date on the chicken that you're using as an ingredient, and it would be best practice not to extend past the date of the chicken that you're using in that sandwich. Again, case by case, I suppose, is the answer to a lot of these queries.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And that might be the same with the next question I'm going to ask, but we'll ask it anyway and just see. So the next one relates to ready-to-eat sandwiches. So for validating L mono over the life of the ready-to-eat sandwich, would testing shelf life, would kind of changing testing shelf life, so like increasing testing on day one, be acceptable to help validate it, or would predictive modeling be best practice?
Okay, so
sorry, Elaine, can I just add there, they're talking about abuse testing. So they're asking, should they start abuse testing on day one?
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So I suppose for ready-to-eat food, I didn't have time to go into it today, but there's some very particular requirements around Listeria monocytogenes, because as I said, it's bacteria that grows very slowly at refrigeration temperatures, but once if that storage temperature increases by even 1 or 2 degrees, the amount that Listeria will grow increases significantly. So when you're looking at worst case scenario, you merely need to take into consideration those recommended temperatures to represent storage temperature at consumer stage and at distribution and retail. For distribution and retail, it's 7 degrees, and for the consumer end, it's 10 degrees. So for that sandwich, it's best to incubate it at the worst case scenario temperatures. And really, the other thing to say, when you're doing a lot of testing, say for Listeria and ready-to-eat food, and you don't find it, it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily there. It's just not there in the portion that you're testing. And you need to think about, if Listeria is found in your food, how will it grow? And the predictive micro is very useful to give you an indication of that. And you can use that to put in different temperature parameters, different pH, different AW, and you'll see if there is Listeria in your product, how would it potentially grow in your product? And then sometimes, depending on the food product, there's 2 different categories in the legislation. One is category 1.2, and that's ready-to-eat foods that support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes. And the second is category 1.3, where it's foods that do not support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes. So usually sandwiches fall into the 1.3 because they have a short shelf life. So there's usually a shelf life of maybe 3 or 4 days at most on a sandwich that's made. But you have to remember it's a multi-component food. So the ingredients that are used to make that sandwich could have a much longer shelf life. And the Listeria could be present in, let's say, sliced ham before you put it into your sandwich. So you need to take that all into consideration when you're thinking about Listeria and ready-to-eat food.
Thank you. The next question relates to TBC. So it says, is TBC the standard for shelf life testing?
I don't understand that question. So total viable counts, or TVCs, are also known as aerobic colony counts, ACCs, or total bacterial count, TBC. They're basically just a general count of all the bacteria that's in a food at any given time. So it's a useful kind of indication of the quality of your food, but it doesn't give you much more information past that. It won't tell you what, you know, say there's 100 bacteria as part of your aerobic colony count, but it won't tell you out of that 100 bacteria is one of those Listeria monocytogenes, is 10 of those a yeast, you know. And you have to remember as well, it's not suitable for every food. So if you're producing a food that's, say, fermented, and you're deliberately adding a starter culture, you're deliberately adding bacteria. So the ACC test or the TBC test is not suitable because you're only counting the bacteria that you put in on purpose at the beginning. So you might need to look at other bacteria that would be a better test. So for example, E. coli or Enterobacteriaceae as an indicator of fecal contamination in your product.
Okay, thank you, Mary. That's very helpful. And finally, our last question asks, is there a predictive modeling program that is easy to use and freely available?
Yeah. So there's a few different predictive modeling programs. One that we would use quite a bit is called Combase. And if you just put Combase into Google, you'll get the link for it. It's quite a useful program, but I would say it's easy for people to not understand the output of those models. If you go to our website, we do have a section on predictive modeling, and it gives you some information around it. Sometimes you might need to ask for help from a trained microbiologist to interpret the output of the model. There is some good videos for how you use Combase on their own website, so maybe if you watch those videos first to understand how to use it and how to input the different parameters and what the output means, it could be useful. But it's quite a good model. And the other thing to remember is a lot of the data that's in Combase is based on bacterial growth in broth. So that's a media that's used to grow bacteria. That's like a substrate. But when food grows in food, or when bacteria grows in food, their growth pattern can be just a little bit different. So you need to bear that in mind. There are some models for food in Combase as well, in the advanced Combase. But I think the best thing to do is go to Combase and look at all the tutorials before you start using it. And then if you have any queries, you can always contact us at the FSAI advice line.
Thank you, Mary. That's very helpful. Thanks, Melanie. So thanks to everybody who's came and joined us this morning. If you enjoyed today's event, you can subscribe for event alerts at www.fsai.ie/subscribe. We will also have a survey that will pop up after this event. So we'd love to know how you found it, what you learned, and what you'd like to know more about. So if you could fill that in, that would be fantastic. So thank you, Mary, for your presentation. And thank you to Sean working away and helping also in the background. And we hope to see you all again soon. So,
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.